In 1943, two deadly forces were racing to end World War II. Above Germany, thousands of Allied bombers were reducing entire cities to ash and rubble. Below the Atlantic waves, Nazi U-boats were silently choking Britain's lifeline, sinking cargo ships loaded with food, fuel, and weapons. Each side was convinced they'd discovered the war-winning weapon. The Allies believed strategic bombing would break German spirit and force surrender. Hitler was certain his submarine wolf packs would starve Britain into submission within months. Both strategies would claim hundreds of thousands of lives. Both would push military technology to its absolute limits. But only one actually came close to winning the war. And the answer will completely change how you think about World War II. Stay with me because what you're about to discover challenges everything most people believe about which weapons truly decided history's deadliest conflict. By the time the story ends, you'll understand why one of these weapons nearly changed the entire course of human history, while the other became one of the most controversial and ultimately ineffective strategies ever deployed. The numbers are staggering, the human cost is heartbreaking, and the strategic implications will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about how wars are really won. When World War II began, strategic bombing was still largely theoretical. Military leaders understood that aircraft could support ground troops, but using bombers to attack an enemy's homeland directly? That was revolutionary. And like most revolutionary ideas, it started with a mistake. On the night of August 24, 1940, German Luftwaffe bombers were flying through darkness over southern England. Their target was supposed to be aircraft factories and oil storage facilities outside London. But navigation in 1940 was primitive. Pilots relied on landmarks, radio beacons, and dead reckoning. In the confusion of night flying, several bombers got lost. When they finally saw what they thought were legitimate military targets below, they dropped their bombs. But they weren't over aircraft factories. They were over the East End of London. Civilian homes exploded. Families were killed in their sleep. It was a mistake, but it would change the course of the entire war. Winston Churchill was furious. The next night, he ordered RAF bombers to retaliate against Berlin. If Germany was going to bomb London, Britain would bomb the Nazi capital. It was a decision that would escalate the conflict in ways nobody could have predicted. Within weeks, Germany launched what would become known as the Blitz, a sustained bombing campaign against British cities that would last for 8 months. The psychological impact was immediate and terrifying. Every evening, air raid sirens wailed across London as hundreds of German bombers approached. But here's what's fascinating. The Blitz failed completely. Despite months of nightly bombing, despite the destruction of huge areas of London, Coventry, and other British cities, civilian morale never cracked. If anything, the bombing seemed to strengthen British resolve. Workers showed up to their jobs even after their homes had been destroyed. By the summer of 1941, Germany was preparing for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. The Blitz was winding down, but for British military leaders, bombing remained the only way to strike directly at Germany. Britain had no army in Europe, no way to attack German forces directly. Strategic bombing was their only offensive option. In early 1941, a new generation of British bombers began entering service. The Avro Lancaster could carry 18,000 pounds of bombs, 4 times the capacity of earlier aircraft. But in those early days, British bombing was incredibly inaccurate. In August 1941, a secret British study delivered shocking news. The Butt report revealed that only about 10% of British bombers were getting their bombs within 5 miles of their intended targets. 5 miles. That's not precision bombing. That's barely hitting the right city. Even worse, German air defenses were taking a terrible toll. By late 1941, British bomber losses were approaching 10% per mission. If you flew 10 bombing raids over Germany, statistically, you probably wouldn't survive. This is where Air Marshal Sir Arthur Harris enters our story, and he's one of the most controversial figures of the entire war. Harris was appointed Commander-in-Chief of RAF Bomber Command in February 1942, and he brought with him an absolute conviction that strategic bombing could win the war single-handedly. Harris had a chilling philosophy about warfare. He believed that German workers were just as legitimate targets as German soldiers. In his view, the German people themselves were the enemy, not just their military forces. He famously said, "There are a lot of people who say that bombing can never win a war. Well, my answer to that is that it has never been tried yet, and we shall see." But his most famous quote was even more ominous. "They sowed the wind, and now they are going to reap the whirlwind." This was a direct reference to the German bombing of British cities, and Harris meant it as a promise. Harris convinced the British government to abandon precision bombing entirely. Instead, RAF Bomber Command would undertake what they euphemistically called area bombing. Let's be completely honest about what this meant. It was carpet bombing, the deliberate targeting of entire areas of cities, regardless of who lived there. The British Air Ministry put this strategy in writing, stating that the goal was to destroy the morale of the civilian population and in particular of industrial workers. This wasn't a military strategy in any traditional sense. It was psychological warfare on a massive scale. In May 1942, Harris organized what was essentially a massive publicity stunt to prove his concept could work. He gathered every available aircraft in Bomber Command, over 1,000 planes, for a single raid on the German city of Cologne. This was the first 1,000 bomber raid in history. On the night of May 30th, 1942, over 1,000 British bombers took off for Cologne. The city's air defenses were completely overwhelmed. 600 acres of Cologne were destroyed, and thousands of buildings were reduced to rubble. But most importantly for Harris, only 39 British aircraft were lost, less than 4%. Winston Churchill was impressed. Harris now had the full backing of the British Prime Minister and unlimited resources to expand his bombing campaign. He also had new weapons that would make his area bombing even more devastating. The Avro Lancaster was finally entering service in large numbers, and it could carry the massive bombs required for area attacks. More importantly, it could carry incendiary bombs designed not to destroy buildings through explosive force, but to set them on fire. When dropped in massive quantities over a city, they could create firestorms, self-sustaining fires that generated their own winds and reached temperatures hot enough to melt steel. Harris began planning a campaign that would systematically destroy every major German city. He believed that if he could create enough destruction, German civilian morale would crack and the Nazi government would be forced to surrender. While Harris was perfecting his doctrine of area bombing, across the Atlantic, American military leaders were developing a completely different approach to strategic bombing. They had studied the early British campaigns and reached entirely different conclusions about how air power should be used. American doctrine was built around the concept of precision bombing in daylight. They looked at the inaccuracy of British night bombing and decided the solution wasn't to abandon precision. It was to improve it dramatically. The Americans put their faith in two revolutionary concepts: the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress and daylight bombing. The B-17 was heavily armed with 13.50 caliber machine guns positioned to provide defensive fire in every direction. American designers believed this aircraft could literally fight its way through enemy defenses without fighter escort. The Flying Fortress was also equipped with the revolutionary Norden bombsight, a mechanical computer that could theoretically calculate the exact moment to release bombs for pinpoint accuracy. American propaganda claimed the Norden bombsight was so accurate it could drop a bomb in a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. More importantly, American military philosophy rejected the British approach of deliberately targeting civilians. American commanders believed that precision attacks on specific infrastructure targets would be more effective than indiscriminate area bombing. In August 1942, the Americans put their daylight precision bombing theory to the test. 12 B-17 Flying Fortresses attacked marshalling yards near Rouen in occupied France. The raid was technically successful, and no American aircraft were lost. For American commanders, this was proof that their concept could work. But the British were deeply skeptical. From their perspective, the Americans had proven they could hit a minor, relatively undefended target with massive fighter support. That was a far cry from bombing deep into Germany. Nevertheless, that winter the two allies agreed to combine their approaches in what they called the Combined Bomber Offensive. The Americans would attack by day against carefully selected infrastructure targets, while the British would attack by night carpet bombing whole areas. But as American bombers began penetrating deeper into German territory, they discovered that their confidence in daylight bombing had been dangerously premature. German fighter pilots were skilled and aggressive, and their aircraft were constantly improving. More importantly, German flak, anti-aircraft artillery, was devastatingly accurate. By the spring of 1943, American losses were climbing steadily. Around 1 in every 15 planes was being shot down, and many more were returning so badly damaged they couldn't fly again. These weren't just machines being lost. Each B-17 carried a crew of 10 men. The crisis came in August 1943, when American commanders decided to prove once and for all that daylight precision bombing could work against the most heavily defended targets in Germany. They planned simultaneous attacks on ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt and aircraft factories in Regensburg, both deep in southern Germany, far beyond the range of Allied fighter escorts. On August 17, 1943, 380 flying fortresses took off for what would become known as Black Thursday. The results were catastrophic. German fighters attacked the unescorted bombers in waves. The loss rate was over 16%. 63 bombers shot down in a single day. The Americans were forced to suspend their deep penetration bombing campaigns entirely. For months, they could only attack targets within range of fighter escorts. The war in the air had reached a stalemate. The solution came from an unexpected source: international cooperation and engineering innovation. The British had been experimenting with an American fighter, the P-51 Mustang. In its original form, the Mustang was good but not exceptional. Its American-built Allison engine limited its performance at high altitudes. But British engineers had an idea. They replaced the Allison engine with a British-designed Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. The results were spectacular. The modified P-51 Mustang suddenly became the best long-range fighter in the world. This wasn't just an incremental improvement. It was a game-changer. The Mustang could now escort bombers all the way to targets deep in Germany and back, fighting off German interceptors throughout the entire mission. In early 1944, as the Allies prepared for the D-Day invasion, both British and American air forces were tasked with a new mission: disrupting German communications and oil supplies to prevent reinforcements from reaching the invasion beaches. The results were dramatic. Allied bombers, protected by long-range Mustang fighters, began hitting bridges, railways, and oil refineries with surgical precision. German fuel production dropped catastrophically. The Luftwaffe was increasingly grounded because they simply didn't have enough fuel to fly their aircraft. But even as precision bombing was finally proving effective, Bomber Harris remained obsessed with area bombing. He continued to argue that carpet bombing of German cities was the key to victory, even as evidence mounted that infrastructure attacks were having far greater strategic impact. This obsession would lead to the most controversial moment of the entire bombing campaign. In February 1945, as Germany was clearly defeated and the war was winding down, Harris ordered the destruction of Dresden. Dresden was a beautiful medieval city in eastern Germany with virtually no military significance. It was packed with refugees fleeing the advancing Soviet army. But Harris ordered it destroyed anyway, in what seems to have been a purely vindictive attack. The bombing of Dresden created another firestorm. Temperatures reached 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit, winds reached hurricane force, and approximately 50,000 people died. Most of them civilians. For the first time, serious questions began to be asked about the morality of the bombing campaign. The human cost of the entire bombing campaign was staggering on both sides. 60% of RAF bomber crews died before completing their 30 mission tours. These were young men in their late teens and early 20s, and they were being killed at a rate that's almost impossible to comprehend today. And what had all this bombing actually achieved? Area bombing, the carpet bombing that Harris championed, had failed to break German morale or significantly reduce German war production. The precision bombing of infrastructure targets had been more effective, but it had only become truly successful in the final year of the war. While the bombing campaigns were grabbing headlines, a much quieter but potentially more decisive battle was being fought beneath the waves of the Atlantic Ocean. This was where Germany's real hope for victory lay, and it came in the form of submarines, U-boats, Hitler understood something fundamental that many military leaders missed. Britain was an island nation that imported almost everything it needed to survive. Food, oil, raw materials for weapons production. All of it had to come by ship across the Atlantic Ocean. Cut those supply lines and Britain would be forced to surrender. By 1940, Britain was importing 55 million tons of supplies annually. The country had enough food reserves to last maybe 3 months without imports. If German submarines could sink cargo ships faster than the Allies could build them, Britain would literally starve. Admiral Karl Donitz, the head of the German U-boat service, was a tactical genius who understood exactly how to make this strategy work. Instead of having submarines hunt alone, he developed wolf pack tactics. Groups of U-boats would be positioned across likely convoy routes. When one spotted Allied ships, it would call in all the others for a coordinated attack. The early results were absolutely terrifying. In the first 18 months of the war, German submarines and surface raiders sank more than 130 British merchant vessels. But when Germany conquered France in 1940, everything changed. Suddenly, German U-boats didn't have to make the dangerous journey through the North Sea to reach the Atlantic shipping lanes. They could operate directly from French Atlantic ports. France's Atlantic coast was soon filled with massive concrete U-boat pens, fortified submarine bases that were virtually impregnable to Allied bombing. The Type WWII U-boat became the workhorse of this campaign. These submarines were relatively small but incredibly seaworthy and could operate for weeks at a time in the rough waters of the North Atlantic. They carried 14 torpedoes and had crews of 44 men. Life aboard a U-boat was incredibly dangerous and unpleasant. The submarines were cramped, poorly ventilated, and constantly damp. The smell of diesel fuel, unwashed bodies, and rotting food was overwhelming. Men slept in shifts because there weren't enough bunks for the entire crew. But these submarines were devastatingly effective. By the end of October 1940, German wolf packs were sinking up to 40% of the ships in some Allied convoys. 40%. German U-boat crews called this period the happy time, and you can understand why. The psychological impact was enormous. Merchant sailors knew that every voyage across the Atlantic might be their last. Many ships sailed alone because there weren't enough escort vessels to protect them. Even in convoy, sailors could do nothing but watch helplessly as ships around them were torpedoed and sunk. Life expectancy for U-boat crews was just 2 combat patrols. 75% of German U-boat personnel were killed during the war. These were young men, many in their early 20s, climbing into steel coffins knowing they probably wouldn't return. Britain's survival depended on developing countermeasures, and this sparked one of the most intense technological races of the entire war. The first breakthrough was radar. Early radar systems were large and could only be fitted to major warships, but by 1940, British scientists had developed centimetric radar that was much smaller and more accurate. This was crucial because U-boats spent most of their time on the surface. They were much faster on the surface than when submerged, and they needed to surface regularly to recharge their batteries. Suddenly, any U-boat caught on the surface became vulnerable to detection. British scientists also developed HFDUF, high-frequency direction finding. Every time a German U-boat surfaced to communicate with its headquarters, HFDUF could triangulate the radio signal and determine the submarine's exact position. But the most important breakthrough came in May 1941, when the British destroyer HMS Bulldog forced the German submarine U-110 to surface and captured it intact. On board was an Enigma machine and the naval code books that went with it. This gave Britain an enormous advantage. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park could now read German naval communications in near real time. They could see exactly where wolf packs were positioned. Convoys could be routed around submarine concentrations. From the German perspective, it seemed like the British had developed almost supernatural ability to avoid their submarines. U-boats would arrive at intercept points to find nothing. But technology was advancing on both sides. The Germans fitted U-boats with radar detectors and anti-aircraft guns. They developed the Schnorkel, an air intake that allowed submarines to stay submerged much longer. The Allies responded with the Hedgehog, an anti-submarine mortar that fired 24 bombs. They created the Lee Light, a powerful searchlight that could illuminate surface submarines at the last moment. During night attacks, the decisive moment came in May 1943, during the battle for Convoy ONS-5. This was Admiral Donitz's attempt to prove that U-boats could still win the war. He assembled 40 submarines, nearly a quarter of his entire operational fleet, for an all-out attack on a convoy of 43 merchant ships. What followed was a 4-day running battle that would determine the fate of the Atlantic War. Night after night, U-boats slipped through the escort screen to torpedo merchant vessels. But the British had brought in reinforcements. Extra support groups rushed to the convoy's aid. Long-range aircraft flew from bases in Canada and Iceland. When the smoke cleared, 11 merchant ships had been sunk, but the Germans had lost 7 U-boats with their entire crews. 2 weeks later, Dönitz tried again with another convoy. This time, it was a complete disaster for the Germans. 5 U-boats were sunk without a single merchant ship being lost. During May 1943, 25% of all operational German U-boats were destroyed. Dönitz was forced to make a devastating admission. He ordered his remaining U-boats to retreat from the North Atlantic convoy routes. The statistics tell the story. In 1940, German U-boats were sinking Allied ships at a rate of 4.4 ships per submarine per month. By 1943, that rate had dropped to 1.1 ships per submarine per month. Meanwhile, U-boat losses had increased dramatically. With the U-boats defeated, massive waves of American troops and equipment could flow across the Atlantic in preparation for D-Day. The invasion of Europe was only possible because the sea lanes were secure. As the traditional U-boat campaign collapsed, German engineers became increasingly desperate. They developed the revolutionary type XXI U-boat, a submarine so advanced it was essentially from a different era. Unlike conventional submarines, the type XXI was designed to operate primarily underwater. It was electric-powered and capable of 17 knots while submerged, more than twice the speed of traditional submarines. It could stay submerged for days, carried 23 torpedoes, and was fast enough underwater to outrun most surface vessels. But it was too little, too late. The first type XXI wasn't commissioned until April 1945, just weeks before Germany's surrender. Only one ever became operational, and it never made contact with the enemy. Meanwhile, the bombing campaign was entering its final phase. Harris continued area bombing right up until the end of the war, even as precision strikes on infrastructure were proving far more effective. The contrast is striking. German submarine warfare had evolved from a highly effective strategy to desperate innovation as the technological balance shifted against them. Allied bombing had evolved from ineffective area attacks to highly successful precision strikes against infrastructure targets. So, which was more effective? The answer becomes clear when you look at what actually changed the course of the war. The U-boat campaign came frighteningly close to succeeding. If Britain's supply lines had been cut, the entire Allied war effort would have collapsed. There would have been no D-Day, no liberation of Europe, no victory over Nazi Germany. At its peak, the U-boat campaign brought Britain within 6 weeks of starvation. If slightly more numerous in 1940 to 1941, German submarines might have forced Britain to negotiate a separate peace. Without Britain as a base for operations, the United States would have faced the prospect of invading a German-dominated Europe alone. The strategic bombing campaign, particularly area bombing, was largely a failure. It didn't break German morale, it didn't significantly reduce German war production until the very end, and it came at a horrific cost in both civilian and military lives. When bombing finally became effective, it was precision strikes against specific infrastructure targets. Both strategies reveal something fundamental about how wars are won. It's not about the most dramatic or destructive weapons. It's about logistics, supply lines, and the ability to sustain your war effort over time. The U-boats understood this, attacking the economic arteries that kept Britain alive. The bombing campaign, when finally effective, focused on specific strategically vital targets. The German U-boats came closer to winning the war for their side than any other single weapon system. The Allied bombers, when they finally focused on the right targets, helped seal Germany's defeat. But it took both sides years to understand what they should have been targeting from the beginning. If this video changed how you think about World War II strategy, Hit that like button and let me know in the comments which moment shocked you the most. Was it the 75% U-boat crew death rate? Or maybe the fact that precision bombing wasn't used effectively until the very end of the war? And here's something that'll blow your mind. There are at least 5 other World War II weapons that historians argue were even more decisive than bombing or U-boats. Next week, I'm revealing the secret weapon that actually won the war. Something that operated in complete silence, changed battles without firing a shot, and saved more lives than any other innovation of the entire conflict. Subscribe and turn on notifications because you won't want to miss this one. The weapon that truly decided World War II isn't what you think it is, and when you discover what it was, you'll never look at the war the same way again. The most powerful weapons aren't always the ones that make the biggest explosions. Sometimes they're the ones operating in shadows, breaking codes, and turning enemy information against.